So welcome back people to another YouTube video, and today we're going to be discussing about carb cycling and how it can help you achieve better results in the gym. The first thing we have to know about carb cycling is that it's something in which we monitor our carb intake for the days that we're training and for the days that we're not training. So in other words, when we do train, we're going to have a good amount of carbs on that day to have a good amount of energy in the gym. And on non-training days, we're going to have less amounts of carbs so that it helps us use our energy differently. And I'll explain why later. So the important thing to remember is that carbs aren't bad necessarily. You know, if we're talking about good carbs such as potatoes, rice, you can go for brown rice if you want, you can go for sweet potatoes, basically foods that you don't find in the middle of the aisle whenever you head to the store. So foods that are on the outside of the aisle are mostly, naturally based whole foods, and these are the foods that you want to indulge in, are the more preferable carbs that you want in your diet. In my beginning years of training, I've been training for 6 years now, and at the beginning I didn't know what carb cycling was, and I wish I did know sooner, because carb cycling helps you control your insulin sensitivity. So insulin sensitivity is when you have this large spike whenever you eat foods. So let's say you have a meal with high amounts of carbs, your insulin will spike. So every time you eat, you have high spikes and high insulin throughout the day, which is something you generally don't want to spike too much, because eventually you can develop insulin resistance. Insulin resistance, another way of saying that your body is having difficulty using those carbs as a energy factor into your workouts. And once you become insulin resistant, it's hard for your body to take in those carbs as an energy source. So what you want to do, you want to monitor your carb intake before and after the gym. And you won't be using the carbs for just like a pure satiety, you won't be using the carbs for just the pleasure of having carbs, in your mouth, or, having desserts or whatever. You want to use carbs for a performance measure. You don't want to use it for a pleasurable, break in a way. It's just like, so you want to use it to its maximum capacity. You want to use that macronutrient as a means to get the highest amounts of performance in the gym as much as possible. Using carb cycling, we can place our carbs in strategic ways on training days where we need them, and we can have less carbs on non-training days. So getting to the whiteboard. So when it comes to carb cycling, so on training days, what you want to do is eat more carbs, especially before and after the gym, which will help in performance issues. And on non-training days, you want to eat less carbs, which would result in less insulin. On non-training days, you don't require that many carbs. You don't require as much carbs as your training days, because you're not performing high intensity workouts, which you need carbs for. So for non-training days, you want to eat less carbs, which would make sense because you don't need the carbs as much as training days. So on non-training days, you eat less carbs, and on training days, you eat more carbs. So basically, eating carbs on training days will result in insulin spikes, but you can mitigate that with having your carbs before and after the gym. And so your insulin spikes are only throughout the middle of the day. So preferably if you go to the gym in the middle of the day. Let's say if you go in the morning, you want to have your carbs before the gym, and you can have your carbs after. Or even at night, you can have your carbs before and after the gym. It's okay, as long as you have it before and after at any time of the day. So on non-training days, you're going to have less carbs, which will result in less insulin spikes throughout the day. So therefore your insulin is going to be kept at a nice base. So therefore your insulin won't be spiked all the time, and you won't develop insulin resistance over time. Because if you eat carbs every single day, too, like a high significant amount of carbs every single day, eventually it can lead to insulin resistance. Or if you develop insulin resistance, you'll develop more fat, because your body is not good at using those carbs as an energy source because of that insulin resistance. So to mitigate that and to have a self-assurance on that, we want to have less carbs on our rest days, which would result in having a healthier health profile overall. We're going to go to the whiteboard just to show you insulin resistance and how that works as a graph. Okay, so I made a carb cycling graph for you guys to better understand the overall insulin resistance profile. And so here we have on X, we have insulin and on Y we have the time. So insulin is dependent on the time of day that you eat. And so here in the morning, let's say we start with 50 grams of carbs. We're gonna have a small little spike, and then later on in the day, just before your workout, we're gonna have 100 grams of carbs. So there you go, we're gonna have insulin spiking once again, but a little higher this time because there's more grams of carbs. There's more for your body to process, and so it's normal to have a higher insulin. After that, after the gym period is done, we're gonna have a low, and then we're gonna eat again, so we're gonna have a higher insulin resistance again. And then later on in the night, we're gonna have 50 grams of carbs again, which will have a little spike here. And so throughout the day, you see that it's low in the morning, it's high in the middle of the day, and then it's low again at night. And so this is what helps regulate insulin. If you had high spikes all the time, that average would be way higher than it's supposed to be. Okay, you want to have a low average of insulin for a better health overall. So if your average line, let's say our average line is like these dots that you see here, if our average is going like past, you know, like really high all the time, it's just not too good for the body. Okay, you want to mitigate insulin, you want to have the lowest amounts of insulin in your body. Okay, not too high. The thing about insulin is that insulin helps develop muscle because of HGH production. So basically human growth hormone. So mTOR as well. mTOR is increased. HGH is increased when you have insulin. So the more insulin spikes you have in a day, the better the overall muscle synthesis you can get. But the thing is that it's somewhat bad. You don't want to get like lots of insulin spikes, because overall, over time, you can get insulin resistance. So we want to mitigate that. We want to have a slightly low insulin in the morning, a slightly low insulin at night, and so midday we want to have a high amount of insulin to perform better. Having low carbs in the morning and low carbs at night is great, because then you can save on your carbs for your training periods so that you have less gradual spikes. Now let's say this is a push day. So on this push day, we're going to have 50 grams of carbs in the morning, 100 grams of carbs before the workout, 100 grams of carbs after the workout, and 50 grams of carbs at night. So this is going to be a nice little demographic of insulin. You know, we have low insulin in the morning, we have you know, an insulin spike before and after the gym, which is what we want for anabolic growth. And then we have a low insulin spike at night, so that, you know, you can go to sleep well, because if your insulin's too high at night, it's harder to go to bed at that time. So this is a proper way of doing, or a proper way of mitigating your carbs throughout the day. So this is a graph for a resting day. So in the morning, we're going to have 50 grams of carbs. We're going to have 50 grams of carbs later on too. Later during the day, we're going to have another 50, and then at night, you know, another 50 grams. So you see here that the average insulin spike is lower than the previous graph that we showed here. This is on a rest day compared to a training day, which was higher. And so this helps regulate insulin throughout the day, so your insulin doesn't get too high. And so that's what carb cycling is, basically. You're just lowering the average insulin for the week, which is great for your body, because your body can do what it needs to do to burn fat more efficiently. If you become insulin resistant, you will burn less fat over time. And so this is how we can use carb cycling to mitigate insulin and to use it to our benefit. So what we have here is a basic layout of a push-pull-leg-rest split. So basically a 3-day on, 1-day rest, 3-day on, 1-day rest split. Now I'll show you how the carb cycling works for this. So as you can see here, we have 200 grams for the push day, 200 grams of carbs for the pull day, 300 grams of carbs for the leg day, and on the rest day, we're going to have only 100 grams of carbs. And then again, 200 grams on a push day, 200 grams on the pull day, 300 grams on the leg day, and then again, 100 grams of carbs on the rest day. So as you can see here on this layout, is that we're going to have carbs being high on the working days and carbs being low on the resting days. This is going to help regulate insulin, because you're going to have high insulin on those days based on your performance periods, and then you can have a lower insulin on the rest days, which will just help insulin resistance overall. So essentially what we learn about carb cycling is that if we have less insulin, then we have less fat storage over time. And if we have more insulin, we're gonna have more fat storage over time. And so the thing is that we want to build muscle, and so we need insulin to build muscle, but we don't want our insulin to be too high. So in order to fix that issue is that we just trick the average amount of insulin that we produce throughout the day in strategic ways. And so, like I was talking about the previous graph, you know, on rest days, we're gonna have lower amounts of insulin. So on rest days, we're gonna have less carbs, because carbs really increase and drive the amount of insulin that we produce. Okay, because it just converts to sugar, and our insulin is there to get that sugar and our sugar levels down. And so on rest days, you want to have less insulin, which will result in less insulin throughout the week. And on training days, you're gonna have more insulin output, so you're gonna have, you know, more carbs on those days. And so having less insulin on our rest days will change that average throughout the week. So throughout the week, we're gonna have a nice baseline for our insulin levels. If your insulin levels were high throughout the whole week, eventually you could probably develop, you know, insulin resistance, and it's harder for you to use carbs efficiently. And so you want to trick the body into stabilizing your insulin levels throughout the week. And so with the graphs I've shown and with the information I displayed, I hope this helps you get a bigger picture of how to use carb cycling for your training purposes, and to gaining muscle as much as possible, and to not gain too much fat in the process. So that's the end of the video, okay? And I hope you guys liked it, and leave me some feedback. You know, I'm always open to insights. I'm always open to comments and stuff like that. And with that, I'll leave you guys be. Have a nice day, and I'll see you on the next one.